Hi, Alex.
Hi, Antonella.
So welcome back to our research reflections number 2. So
Mhm.
today we are going to go through a study that actually made a lot of headlines. And so Alex, if you'll walk us through, this is a plant-based study, right? Sort of looking at plant-based versus omnivorous
Yeah.
diets. And I'm super excited because there's lots of nuance here and we both really appreciate nuance.
Yes, we do indeed. Okay, so this one, you may have heard of this one. It was published in 2023. It was about twins. So that was like the big, the,
Mhm.
the big thing that people talked about. It was the twins study. So it was actually called Cardiometabolic Effects of Omnivorous versus Vegan Diets in Identical Twins, a randomized clinical trial. And it was published, like I said, in 2023 in the Journal of the American Medical Association's Network Open. And so this study took 22 pairs of twins. So there were 44 people specifically, but two, you know, uh,
Yeah,
22
22
pairs of
pairs.
twins. Yeah.
Mhm.
And they split each twin group, and one twin was set up with an omnivorous diet, a healthy omnivorous diet, and the other twin was set up with a plant-based or vegan diet. They were randomly assigned, so no one got to choose what diet they were going to go to. They were each assigned randomly to their respective diets. And this took place over an 8-week period of time. And that's important because the first 4 weeks, they were given the meals. So they didn't have to think about how to eat. They were given the plant-based or the healthy omnivorous diet. They just sat down and ate what was given to them. And then in the second 4 weeks, they had to prepare their own food. Now, they were given direction to do that in education pieces, and they, of course, had 4 weeks of example to work off of,
Mhm.
but they were responsible for their own diets at that point. After the 8-week period of time, certain things were compared to what they were at baseline. So the whole point of the study was actually to look at what happened to LDL cholesterol at the beginning and then after that 8-week period of time. So that primary outcome was LDL cholesterol because they were trying to see if eating a plant-based diet was going to have positive impact or not on cardiovascular health using LDL cholesterol as a proxy.
Mhm.
They also had secondary outcomes as well, which is really typical of these types of trials. So there was one main thing they were looking at, but there were some secondary items of interest. And in this particular case, it included all of the other sort of lipid parameters that come along with LDL cholesterol. It included glucose and insulin levels, B12 levels, their weight, and also something called TMAO, which you're going to tell us more
Yeah,
about a
which we'll
little
talk
bit
about.
later.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so after the 8-week period of time, again, like I said, they compared the changes to all of those parameters to their baseline levels and compared the twins, right?
Mhm.
So the results of the study were that there was a significant difference in LDL cholesterol, weight, and insulin levels, which favored the vegan group versus their omnivorous twin pairs. So
Mhm.
what that meant is we just saw a bigger reduction in all three of those things. We saw greater reduction in LDL cholesterol, greater reduction in insulin levels, and a greater reduction in body weight in the vegan diet group versus that omnivorous group. And so that leaves everything else being unchanged. So there was no difference in HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, glucose, B12, or TMAO, which again, we're going to talk about later.
Mhm.
So that is our study in a nutshell.
Yes.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we found really interesting here, but starting with why this study made such big news.
Yeah, I mean, I think it made big news as like the primary headline was a vegan plant-based diet is better for cholesterol. And we had this interesting aspect to the study that I think we both really take as a positive is that they were twins, right? They were really trying to minimize any other variables that like we can't readily see in keeping genetics as constant as you can.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, we've got twins, right? People with the same genetic makeup. We give one an omnivorous diet, we give one the plant-based, and the vegan's gonna win out. They lost weight, their insulin levels went down, and their LDL cholesterol went down. However, when we get into it, there's actually like really concrete reasons why those things happened. And unfortunately, because not all things were actually held constant, so they did a really good job of holding that genetic aspect constant, let's say. But in the makeup of the diets, there was actually a lot of variability. But I think the first one worth highlighting is the insulin weight piece. Because that vegan group actually lost weight because they ate less calories over the 8 weeks. So we would expect that they, one, would lose weight, and as a consequence of that weight loss, that insulin would go down. Whereas the omnivorous group, they kept their calories pretty constant. So we didn't see weight loss in them. It was pretty minor. And they didn't have they had some insulin change, but not as significant as the plant-based group.
Right. Yeah. And I think as we move forward, this is going to be a common refrain that instead of the answer or the conclusion maybe being that the plant-based diet made people lose weight, the plant-based diet made people have lower cholesterol or have lower insulin, it's possible, especially as it relates to weight and insulin, that it had to do with the caloric deficit that led to those changes. And we'll highlight that again, but there was nothing necessarily special about the vegan diet. We know that the people who were engaged in the vegan diet simply ate fewer calories, which is how they lost weight. So
yeah. So that's that first weight insulin. I think we've got a good explanation for that.
Yeah.
Then when we go to the LDL, so that cholesterol piece, the major difference between the two groups was in their macro composition, right? So the percentage of saturated fat that they were consuming. So even before and after for the vegan group, that saturated fat consumption really changed dramatically from when they started to when they ended the study, as well as the percentage of saturated fat to their overall calories. So they actually went down, and Alex, you wrote down the number, so you correct me if I'm remembering.
Yep.
But I think they started at 13% or 12.8%, and then they went down to 7.6 or 7.8%, was it?
Yep.
So they had
7.6.
they had a pretty significant change in the amount of saturated fat. And they dropped below the recommended 10% saturated fat of the diet. So they were well below that 10%. So we would expect LDL to change under those circumstances.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And I think just before I highlight that, because this is an area that I feel really passionate about explaining, the omnivorous group, they also saw a reduction in their saturated fat intake because it was a healthy omnivorous diet. But it was still higher, than the vegan group and above this 10% threshold that I'm about to dive into a little bit more. So they went from, I think, 13 down to about 11%. So instead of dropping, almost 5%-ish, in the vegan group, they went down by 2% in terms of their saturated fat. And again, not under that pseudo-magical 10% threshold for saturated fat. And so if some of you are wondering what that 10% threshold is all about, generally speaking, it is recommended if someone is trying to manage their cholesterol that their saturated fat intake be under 10% of their total daily calories. And the reason for that is within reason, because there's some genetic variability questions and so on and so forth. But the bulk of us will see a linear relationship to a major degree with saturated fat intake and cholesterol increases, specifically LDL cholesterol increases. And there's something about that 10% line that if we can get below that, then we start to see this really concrete, very real decrease in cholesterol levels, LDL cholesterol levels. If we're above that, we're not going to see that change in a meaningful way, again, for most of us. So put a different way is if you had 20% of your total daily calories came from saturated fat and you made a significant effort to get that saturated fat content down, and it went from 20% to, let's say, 12%, which is a huge change, it's quite possible that your cholesterol wouldn't reflect that big work that you did because it didn't go below that 10% threshold. Meanwhile, like in this study, if you go from 13% down to 7%, so proportionately a smaller change than my example of 20 to 12, because it went through that 10% and under, we would anticipate seeing an LDL cholesterol decrease as we did. Whereas our omnivorous group, which stayed above that 10% threshold, did not.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that saturated fat, the fact that that wasn't maintained constant, doesn't allow us to really say it's the plant-based nature of the diet. Like that isn't, it's not a single variable that's moving because we're actually, this is very much not apples to apples in that case, right? Because someone is just consuming higher saturated fat in their diet and the other people are consuming way less. And then you go to compare them. Yes, we would expect this group. So the question still stands that if we maintain saturated fat constant below 10% and then compared animal versus plant-based to see if there's something particular about the plant-based, because that question still exists, right? There could be something particular, but we would really need to maintain those things constant, which they didn't. And then there was also like big discrepancies in other food categories, right? Because the omnivorous group was actually consuming way less vegetables, less fruit, less whole grains and starchy vegetables. So there was actually a pretty big gap in terms of how they were eating in terms of diversity and fiber and phytonutrients and other things that can be cholesterol lowering, like nuts and legumes and whole grain potentially.
Yeah. And that's very true. They were quite different. If I look at my notes here, actually, with those numbers, the omnivorous group, in addition to a certain amount of like targeted animal product, right, which wasn't outrageous. It was 6 to 8 ounces of meat, fish, or poultry, 1 egg, and 1.5 servings of dairy each day. And then they were encouraged to have 3 servings of vegetables, 2 servings of fruit, and 6 servings of grains or starchy vegetables. So you can see why it was defined as like a healthy omnivorous diet. This was actually better than many dietary patterns, the average dietary patterns that we might see. But in contrast to the plant-based or vegan group, which were encouraged to have 6+ servings of vegetables, 3 servings of fruit, 5 servings of legumes, nuts, seeds, or vegan proteins, and 6 servings of starchy vegetables a day. Like you pointed out, the impact of having legumes, higher fiber, nuts and seeds, all of which independently can reduce cholesterol levels regardless of whether you eat plant-based or not, kind of skews our confidence in, is it again that it was plant-based, or was it the addition of these foods which made the difference in the end?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think those are the major things for those primary outcomes. I think our second discussion point that we thought was really valuable is sort of this use as a biomarker, like as you had said it, right? Like as a proxy for a clinical outcome. And we're sort of in this awkward situation where LDL as a biomarker in terms of clinical outcomes, actually we're not that bothered by, and Alex will explain why. But we've also got the other side of the coin that we've got this biomarker that really highlights like why biomarkers sort of want our ears to perk up, I think is maybe the take home for us, right? Like biomarker in clinical outcome, like they're not the same. And so we don't always want to make them equivalent, even though LDL, we can sort of flirt with some equivalents here, which you, I think, are really good at highlighting. So let's take that one first.
Yeah. And yes, so to your point, whenever we see biomarker data, which means that there's a lab marker or something along those lines that's being tested, or that's the outcome that is being evaluated in a study as a proxy for some sort of health outcome, we have to pay attention, and we're trained to do that, right? So if you and I are reading studies and we look at something that's really interesting and it goes, this thing changes this blood value, and you think to yourself, but I actually really care if the condition is what's going to be affected, which they maybe could have studied, but instead they're studying this blood test. We're always being aware of that, because sometimes it's a bit of a lazy way, or a way of getting information that may not reflect what really needs to be looked at over the long term. Now, like you said, LDL cholesterol is a bit of an exception to the rule here. I will often tell people that we use LDL cholesterol as a proxy. It's not really so much that whether your cholesterol is high or low, it's because it increases your risk for cardiovascular disease, specifically atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, that we care about the cholesterol. So the cholesterol being up or down, it is in and of itself not the concern. It's what does it increase the risk of? And in this case, we have so much certainty. In fact, LDL cholesterol is considered causal for atherosclerotic heart disease, considered the necessary and sufficient ingredient for the development of atherosclerosis. So when we look at it as a biomarker, we can with confidence say, if that number goes down, we are decreasing the risk of that group for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease in the future. And it so happens that LDL cholesterol changes quite quickly in response to treatment, whether that's dietary change or drug or whatever. And so an 8-week window is also appropriate because we can see changes that we feel are real because we know that LDL cholesterol can change that fast. And because we have so much confidence for it in terms of risk evaluation for cardiovascular disease, we can make those leaps.
Yeah.
However, we can't do that for very many things and have that same level of confidence. That being said, we can't also study people for 20 years, and that's the reason why biomarker data gets used so often. So even though I just said we're cautious about that, the reality is that if we're trying to come to any conclusions, we often have to look at biomarkers to start anyway, because we can't, we have to have a sense of whether this is going to work. And if you only have 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 6 months, if you're lucky, sometimes you have to look at those proxies. But there is a danger to that. And I'm going to throw it back to you because TMAO is definitely more in your wheelhouse.
Totally.
Yeah. So tell us about the TMAO, which was one of the secondary outcomes and is also a biomarker and a proxy for something where in this case didn't really pan out.
Yeah. So I think TMAO is, I would say, has a lot of airtime in the functional medicine space as people who want to get their heart risk evaluated will get this TMAO run. So a lot of integrative functional medicine docs will really put a lot in TMAO. And so it's a biomarker. It's a metabolite of gut flora as it breaks down animal-derived products. So it was this is sort of the string of thinking is, right, the more meat you eat, your gut flora is going to help break it down. We can measure that TMAO, and then that TMAO is actually a biomarker that shows us risk factor for heart disease. But it's that jump from TMAO to heart attacks, right? That's I think where we want to have that question, does TMAO actually result in more heart attacks? This is the thing that we care a lot about is preventing the heart attack or the cardiovascular event, not so much the TMAO, but it might tell us something interesting. Different than LDL, which there's not established causality, right? That word is used so little in the scientific space, right? It takes a lot of work for that word to even be thrown around.
Yeah.
And for example, in this study, right, where we had very, obvious more meat consumption against the plant-based, the TMAO didn't change between the groups. It was non-significant, right? There was literally nothing to call home about, nothing to see here, which I think calls into question, right, the validity of using it as an exam, right, when we can't really tie it to data, right? It's sort of a wash. If you ate meat, it was the same as if you didn't eat meat. And then, right, how that is risk and cost to the consumer and stress, because I think that's hard to look at a lab result. You're oh God, this TMAO is high. It can create undue stress when we don't have a lot to hang our hats on here. So there was nothing to call home about the TMAO. I think a good example on the flip side of that biomarker that is different than a clinical outcome, right? And we don't have heart attack data here. These were healthy 40-year-olds, roughly the average age. So we don't really have that clinical outcome data. So there's always that little grain of salt, I think, is what we're trying to underline too.
Yeah. And I think what we were I think it was a good idea or a nice addition to do the TMAO because we do have to build this evidence over time. And this was a real opportunity to learn a little bit more about what that could look like. And, as we move our way towards some conclusions, one of the things we were keeping our eyes open for was, is there something that could be exclusively attributed to the plant-based diet, right? And if there had been a difference, if that plant-based diet group had seen lower TMAO levels, statistically significantly lower, in addition to lower LDL cholesterol, then we could say, okay, Well, maybe that LDL cholesterol was lower because of the saturated fat question, because they had more fiber content in their diets, which we know reduces LDL cholesterol. But they also statistically significantly had lower TMAO. So, overall, this may look like a better package for better cardiovascular health down the road. But we're not left with that conclusion because the TMAO is the same between both groups. So we're still circling around yes, we saw these changes, but there may not be anything special related to the plant-based exclusivity of it all.
Yeah. I think that's a great summary. So as we transition back to sort of that conclusion, like clinically, where does this leave us? Because I think there was the positive that we saw that like it's totally possible to impact your LDL levels using diet and nutrition over a relatively short enough period of time. Like that's definitely, I think, something to be taken from this study, right? 2 months, you lower your saturated fat, you're going to see a result on the other end. That's a definite win.
Yeah.
Any other wins we might be missing or positives?
Yeah, I would say, this was a group of healthy people, right? They were young. They were not going into this with high cholesterol per se. They were pretty average, healthy, young people. And yet we still were able to see that change to the LDL cholesterol, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, I was going to say double-edged sword, and that's not it at all. It's that we just have to focus on who the population is, right? So we're often studying people who have quite elevated cholesterol when we're looking at trying to reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. And often people who are not as well and have higher levels of certain things will respond more strongly to the treatments that are being applied. And in this case, we have a group of people who weren't that, I'm going to call it badly off, right, going into this. And they still saw benefit, which certainly, from my perspective, sets them up for even better cardiovascular success over the long term if, and I'm going to throw this back to you, if they're able to keep up with the diet, right?
Yes.
And so there was an interesting reflection here in relation to the sustainability of this approach.
Yeah, so where there was a difference in opinion, so this is more that like qualitative data in the surveys afterwards, the plant-based group really showed or expressed that they had less satisfaction with the diet. So it was just harder to keep up with, especially like in social settings, right, and eating out. And so I think sometimes those little details get glossed over because the benefit of a diet like this is like you can make a change in 8 weeks, but then we want you to continue it for forever.
Yeah.
Right? Like I don't think we say that enough. Like it's just like this prescription is forever.
Infinity.
Yeah, for infinity and beyond.
Yeah.
And so like dietary satisfaction actually makes a really big difference because one, we have to take this diet out into the world and travel with it and work with it and live with it and have celebrations. And so if at some point someone's like, I can't do this anymore, and then they swing in the other way, like have we really made gains? Rather, if we can like take these principles with flexibility, right? Like if we can stay true to the principles, which like the high fiber, diversity, less than 10% saturated fat, and achieve those in a way that for someone can lead to longevity, right? Like if someone's like, I would prefer to be omnivorous, it's just going to make my life easier. I think the study still lets us say that, right? Like it's still, those principles have held strong, and we don't have anything specific about the plant-based nature of it. And I think motivation and all of that is a really big deal when it comes to diet and nutrition.
And I think that's it. I think, as this study made big waves, and maybe some of you listening are plant-based already, and you think, I don't have any problems sticking with my plant-based diet. I think we also have to realize that in a situation like this, which again, I appreciate that they just took a group of people who weren't plant-based to start, if you have, we're going to call it ethical reasons for eating in a plant-based way, you're going to be more motivated. The motivation is inherently deeper and more, well, maybe not inherently, but it's a whole other layer of motivation, right? And if someone is trying to find a way to eat for their best long-term health, that layer is maybe not there. And we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about the sustainability of these pieces. And so some people could learn to love that plant-based diet and given enough time and direction and support, absolutely be able to carry on. And that's possible too. But to your point, I think what we were left with was, despite the aura of plant-based is superior coming out of this study being published, it didn't seem clear to us that there was anything that was inherently superior to the plant-based diet in this study.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and which is not to say that there couldn't be, and we're not anti-plant-based diet.
Right.
Absolutely not. But someone who did want to eat omnivorously and take these strategies, there's no reason to suspect, based on this study, that they couldn't be successful if they were taking those pieces out. That I think that's the conclusion we very quickly came to, and nothing changed our mind as we were going through that. And we were looking for that because it started right with that weight loss piece, which was caloric deficit induced. And so if we had seen that in our omnivorous group, that probably would have been taken out of the equation altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other aspect on the diet engagement is also that for the first 4 weeks they were fed, right? Like there wasn't there wasn't planning and grocery shopping and all of those things, right? Like the food just showed up. And so I think this can happen in nutrition research, right? Like that isn't the real world. And so I think there is a little bit of friction between great, when it shows up, you heat it up, you eat, is way different than the real world. And we're also putting this study alongside very big outcome data that is omnivorous and holds to those principles, that I think it gives room for both, that we can really individualize it to the person in front of us. And it doesn't have to be I don't know what the word is. It doesn't have to be prescriptive, in one specific way. There are many very different ways, and diet satisfaction and feasibility and longevity are actual factors in addition to those health outcomes. Piece. I think.
Yeah. That's a great conclusion.
All right. So this is a good one to talk about. I'm excited for our next one, and thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.